Thank you. Right. So, Julian, I'm really looking forward to this conversation, which we're going to have soon. And I thought what I'll do is I'll start, as musicologists tend to do, by sort of using you as a subject of my study and introducing you. And then we'll get cracking into the conversation. So, reviewing Julian Dawes's Wigmore Hall concert of entirely of his music in December 2018, I observed in to the journal Tempo, actually, was I was writing for, that his extensive creative oeuvre has found particular vigor in dramatic genres relating to the solo voice, chorus, or the stage, with song cycles and oratorios in biblical or on Holocaust poetry, whilst in his instrumental works he displays a lighter theatrical and more abstract idiom. And of Julian Dawes's style, I wrote, and I quote myself, discernible are the echoes of the English pastoralism deriving from Herbert Howells, the textural richness of Walton, and the elegance of Berkeley, mingled with the caustic irony of Shostakovich and Kurt Weill, and the rhythmic impetus of Prokofiev and Stravinsky. Now, if I was to revise that review some 13 years later, I would probably add into the mix of influences, having listened to quite a few more pieces by Julian since 2008, the sensuality of Debussy and Ravel, or the joyous ebullience of Leonard Bernstein. And I'd also add to the genres that I mentioned, which Geraldine actually referred to, the vocal and choral works designed expressly for synagogal worship, and also instrumental works inspired by Jewish texts. Um, and above all, I'd want to stress that throughout this richly varied output, it is Julian's unmistakable voice which shines through, evident in specific musical mannerisms as well as in an overall integrity of expression, which impels all his works with a distinctive voice and character. When I hear and enjoy a work by Julian, I know that it can only be by him. So I have to, for the sake of disclosure, say that I've had the privilege of knowing Julian not only professionally for many years, but also as a friend. And without going into too many details, Julian and Anne have played a very important part in the life of myself and my wife, Bea. More to be discussed, as they say. Early on, performing some of his music, I was introduced to his style as a performer, as a pianist, and but also over the last 2 decades, I've more or less reviewed, well, quite a few of the premieres of his works and written about his concerts and recordings. Now, some of the live events I've covered would have taken place under the aegis of organizations such as the Jewish Music Institute, about which you've just heard, but also the Spiro Institute or Spiro Arc, and also organized by Julian's admirers and Julian himself. And all of these live events have been a pleasure because Julian has a habit of appearing in person at these concerts, making everyone feel at ease, introducing his works, which are rather complex, in a very accessible manner. And what I wanted to say was that whilst lockdown has put an interruption to all these wonderful live events, which many of us have enjoyed over the years, I hope that this afternoon's conversation on Zoom will somehow take over some of the pleasures that we've been missing over the last year or so. So I want to start by giving a brief overview of Julian's career and output, and then I'm going to ask Julian himself to comment a little bit about his background and education. So in order to do this, I'm going to share screen now. I'll probably disappear into a little blob, but anyway, here we go. Um, right. Sorry, I'm in the wrong slide. Here we go. So, as we've heard, Julian was educated in Birmingham and then at the Royal College of Music, and has had various posts, particularly in music theatre. And he's been a music director for theatre companies and written a huge amount of theatre music. And that's really how I came to know him first. Amongst them, I'll just highlight the fact that Julian's scores for Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle and Edward II are the sort of recognized scores held by the Brecht estate in Berlin, and frequently used. And he's written an enormous amount of music, as you can see here. I'm just going to skip immediately to the next slide, if that actually works. If I was to divide up Julian's works in a sort of simple way, I can put the Jewish music on the right here and the, as it were, non-Jewish music, if there's such a thing, on the left. But the main thing is to notice the breadth and the eclectic variety of genres. So, as well as the theatre music, which we've mentioned, he's written a mandolin concerto, as Geraldine mentioned, which was actually a prize, a score for a competition, a mandolin competition. I believe he's written other works for mandolin, some of them for chamber groups. Amongst the chamber works, there's a notable output of sonatas and suites for various instruments, and I've listed here some of them: violin, cello, flute, recorder, oboe, clarinet, and horn, giving particular instrumentalists a lot of wonderful new music. Song cycles on poetry ranging from Emily Dickinson, Chinese verse, Shakespeare, Brecht songs, Rambo, Blake, and oh, there's Miller. I wonder what that was. It could have been some of my own poetry, and a real variety of music that, I mean, quite prolific, because these are not just individual songs, but these are complete cycles, sometimes 15 or so songs in a go. On the Jewish art music front, we have a series of song cycles on the topic of the Holocaust, concerts and songs on Hebrew poetry, synagogue settings, specifically for liturgical purpose, some liturgical inspired works for the concert hall, and finally a set of larger scale works, which I'll call at the moment cantatas. So this is just to give a spread of what we're talking about here. Now, a few titles. We'll be discussing this in a bit more detail when I talk specifically about certain works. But the song cycle, these are now only from the Jewish works. The song cycle that sort of really launched this was Songs of Ashes in 1991, which was premiered, and I mentioned the Spiro Institute. That was the organization that presented it in 1992. Since then, there have been at least four other song cycles on Jewish topics, and the larger scale works, which are some possibly could be staged, oratorios, cantatas, which I've indicated here on the right. The Death of Moses start in 2003, all the way through to a very exciting in-progress work, Psalm 118, and we'll be discussing those in a second. From the choral repertory, Julian's been extremely prolific, and both in Hebrew and in English translation, some of the biblical texts that he set out here, and we'll be discussing some of these, including the three liturgical pieces for Selichot, which we'll deal with later, and a few others. So again, here are the titles. You can see the sort of scope. Now, I want to sort of be a little bit more nuanced and say that out of all those works, we can discern some pieces, I would say, which are purely designed for the concert hall, but are based on liturgy. So, for example, the setting of the Shema prayer, which one would hear in a synagogue, but it's set here for a concert arrangement, a medium of soprano, mezzo-soprano, and cello. Whereas, for example, we have a Ki Lekach Tov, the setting of the text that's recited when the scrolls are replaced in the ark, written for a minyan, an egalitarian minyan. And then on the right-hand side of the page are a selection of works which are for instruments, but they take the form of prayers. reflection, meditation, psalms. What's behind these works? This is something I'd like to sort of explore a little bit with Julian. Why he's doing this rather unusual thing. So that's more or less what I'm hoping to discuss. But I want to start by asking Julian maybe to share some of his um, insight, well, share some of his experiences really about his background and education, um, particularly actually also his about his teacher Herbert Howells, who's a very noted British composer, and other important compositional influences that he might have from his sort of education. Before getting on to talking about his actual works, so Julian, over to you. I hand over
Thank
the
you very much,
microphone.
and thank you, Geraldine, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Malcolm, for such a range of stuff over my work. I hope I live up to it all. Yes, I showed a propensity for playing the piano, and so I started piano lessons when I was 4 or 5. And one of the things I must now tell you immediately is that I'm Jewish, but I wasn't born Jewish. And I tell you that because between the ages of 8 and 12, I was in 2 cathedral choirs. Prior to that, I'd been in the ordinary local church choir. I didn't come from a religious family. I didn't come from a family that went to church. But because of my musical ability, I found myself singing in church choirs, then 2 cathedral choirs. First Birmingham Cathedral, and then Peterborough Cathedral. And what that meant was that, particularly at Peterborough, twice a day, morning and evening, every day, I would be singing services with the great language of literature of the English cathedral tradition. Composers like Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, Purcell, and right up to even Palestrina, Stanford, and the person who was to become my own teacher, Herbert Howells. And that's important, because I think that means that one was performing this music, not just performing it, but performing it to the very highest standard. The cathedral choirs are, in effect, professional choirs, even though the children in it are between 8 and, say, 13. So I was exposed to this very, very high standard of performance, and I think that had a big effect on my music, as we'll see. After Peterborough, I started to play the organ, and I eventually became assistant organist to my organ teacher, who was one of the greatest Bach players of his day, a man called George Miles in Birmingham. And then I went on to the Royal College of Music, where I studied composition with Herbert Howells. Herbert Howells was one of the nicest people I think I've ever met, apart from all the people who are here today. He was very exacting. He was very self-critical. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of Herbert's music wasn't published until after his death because of his own dissatisfaction with it. He was very exacting, very demanding in terms of use of harmony and particularly counterpoint. I wasn't particularly good at counterpoint when I became a student, and I had to become much better at that. Instrumentation too. And also he didn't expect me to write in any particular way. He didn't expect me to follow any particular course. And remember that I was a student between 1961 to 1964, where Webern and Stockhausen was the thing. And basically, if you didn't write like that, you didn't have much going for you. I did try to write like that, and I admire their music, but it wasn't in a way that I could express myself. And he allowed me to do what I felt I wanted to do, and that was a great thing. He was a great encourager of me. Um, his criticism of me was I always wrote far too many notes, and of course it's easy to write too many notes, and to this day I still tend to do that. So part of the composition process always is paying attention to that and paring things down, so that it's the old question of not a note too much and not a note too little. My other teacher, who I would like to highlight at the Royal College of Music, was my piano teacher, Hubert Dawes. And I mentioned him. I did piano accompaniment with him, but over the 3 years I was there, I learned an enormous amount of music, about music from him. And he later on became a very close friend of myself and my wife. I'll leave it there for a moment.
So that's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Julian. I mean, that's very interesting about the accompaniment. I was actually going to ask you how you got into the world of theatre music, and I'm just wondering whether the piano was, the one of the roots at that time, or what did you contemplate upon, as it were, graduating, and what was the sort of direction that you had in mind? Were you going to go to become an organist, or
No,
did you want to do what Herbert Howells was doing, or
no.
how did you get to the theatre?
I was going to go to the Opera House as a repetiteur. And I studied repetiteur work with, what was his name? His name's escaped me. It was actually in my mind a second ago. What was it? No, no. But I had a letter of introduction to the Munster Opera House. But at that moment, um, through a friend of a friend, I was offered a job as musical director of a theatre company that was doing a tour of the United States with the Beggar's Opera, the original Beggar's Opera, not Brecht's, the original Beggar's Opera. And that was also, it's worth saying, an enormous, learning experience, because immediately after I left the Royal College of Music, I was responsible for the standard of performance for the Beggar's Opera for the whole of that tour. And that was a steep learning curve. I had previously in the Royal College of Music done a lot of work in the opera school as a repetiteur. The person who directed that was a great theatre director called John Baxley. And he was very impressed by what I did with that company, and invited me, when I came back from the tour, to teach singing at the Drama Centre. And that's what I did. And through that, that's how I got into writing music for the theatre, and did that for many years. Wrote productions for many theatres, and I was very lucky to work with directors who wanted to use music as a central part of their production. So that's how I got into the theatre.
Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting, Julian. So I wanted to say that we should listen to a little bit of Julian's music now. And in fact, I wanted to sort of plunge straight into some of the song cycles. But the link there is clearly in my head that actually Julian's song settings have a wonderful sense of theatre to them. That they bring alive the sort of drama of the text in particular ways, and I'm not saying that the music is incidental in any way. No, it's actually it's characterizing, and it's full of character and sort of characterizing the text. So that's one thing I wanted to say, and that sort of comes out of the theatre aspect.
Can I just interrupt and say I don't like the word incidental music when it's applied to theatre or film or television. It's not a correct
Yes,
word.
exactly. Yes, it's like the word accompanies sometimes is not a great one.
Yeah.
um, Let's. I'm going to switch back into my PowerPoint mode, and so we're going to listen to um, a a song which we'll then discuss where it's from in a bit more depth. Okay, so first of all, I'll just share the screen, um, and here we go. I think I think this is the one. Um, I'm just trying to get to the. Uh, there we go. Yeah, so what we're going to listen to, Julian, is your, and I have to say that Julian chose these extracts, and I'm merely being his voice at the moment. The first song we're going to listen to is from the song cycle called "I Never Saw Another Butterfly," which were poems written by the Jewish children of Terezin. I mean, a number of composers have set these, and Julian's is actually a unique one. It's also performable not only by professional singers but also by children themselves. And as Julian's noted, this is particularly poignant when it happens. I have to just also say that I really was very privileged to actually take part. I think it was in the premiere of this piece actually with some children at Alyth. That's correct. I can't remember exactly what year that was,
Yes, I think
but
that was
anyway,
right.
yeah. So we're going to listen to one of the songs, which is
This recording of this song is from my CD of music on Jewish scenes, Echoes of the Soul, and it's been performed here as it was in a concert also by a children's choir, the Finchley Children's Music Group, directed by Grace Rossiter, with Joe Ramadan on the piano.
so that this was a beautiful song actually. I just noticing every time I listen to it, I hear new things, Julian. Um, I mean, the child, there's the sort of the childhood innocence in there, as well as this very forlorn type of flittering away feel to the harmony. I'm just wondering, if you can say something a little bit about um, how you approach this poetry, which has, so much
Well,
historical meaning to it.
it comes from a book called I Never Saw Another Butterfly, which is a book of poems and drawings by children in Theresienstadt. And there were 11 songs that I got the rights to. None of the children who wrote the songs in this cycle survived. They all were murdered. I was very struck by it. Perhaps when we come to the next piece, we'll talk a little bit about writing Holocaust music. But I was caught by the expression of the thoughts and the feelings and the concerns of the authors, who were some of them very young. They ranged from 7 or 8 to 13 or 14. And I was struck by the power of them. In the first 2 verses of The Butterfly, I think the poignancy which I tried to create is really the important thing. But then you have something very different. For 7 weeks I've lived in here, end up inside this ghetto, which is about being in the concentration camp. One interesting thing when the singing started is, and it's quite typical of me in many ways, is the use of polychords. It was a great day for me when I discovered that I could write very pleasing and expressive polychords when the bass chord was in its second inversion. And I discovered that by accident. And I've used that technique a great deal in my music generally.
Yeah, thanks.
Quite typical of my harmony, I think.
So you mentioned the next piece because I think we'll expand on this the Holocaust topic, looking at the next piece, which is well, I wanted to say to you one of my questions about how you got into music theatre. My other question was going to be how did you get into writing Jewish music, or rather songs, or music based on Jewish inspiration. And I think I've got a sort of an answer, and you'll have to tell me if I'm correct. But am I correct in thinking that the Songs of Ashes was perhaps your first foray into writing music on Jewish themes? I don't know if
Certainly,
that's accurate, but
certainly, certainly the first big work.
first big. Okay, so
That's right.
that's
So,
so
so,
so.
so, so,
mm,
so I had rejected Christianity when I was 18 or 19 on specific grounds. One was that I didn't believe in the resurrection, and I didn't believe Jesus was God incarnate. And I had no religious involvement for the next 20 years until I met my current wife, Anne, who is Jewish, and she persuaded me to come to a Kol Nidra service. And suddenly I discovered that there was an enormous amount of liturgy that I was very familiar with. And on taking that forward and thinking, I suddenly realized, if I can put it in this crude way, that I could have all the things I did believe in without the things I didn't believe in. And I decided at a certain point to convert, and I became Jewish some 5 years later. In terms of writing music for the Holocaust, I don't think I'm different to any other Jew in this respect, but particularly since I became Jewish, I think it was important for me to try to come to terms with with what had happened to 6 million Jews. And I was very aware that I couldn't get my head around the idea of 6 million people being murdered in such terrible circumstances. And what I found was that I could, on the other hand, write settings of poems that told individual stories. And that's what the poems of the Songs of Ashes do, by the Polish poet Wysocki. They tell individual stories. I think I needed to come to terms with the events of the Holocaust, as everybody does. Some people, of course, don't, but everybody needs to, on some level.
Julian, I just wondered if you can say something a little bit about how the personal type of connection to the poetry came about. Firstly, for example, how you encountered the poet or the poetry, and secondly, did the circumstances of the premiere, I mean, with the Spyro incident, did that play a role perhaps in at all in the genesis of the piece? I was just interested who you know who how you got to the poetry and how you got to the idea of
Right.
writing a song cycle, really.
Well, I was looking for, I decided I wanted to write a song cycle on the Holocaust. And I
Hmm.
was looking for poetry and I consulted Lisa Spiro. That was a rather extraordinary meeting. It's the first time I met her. When I arrived in her office, she was sitting there with Wilhelm Wagner, Wagner's great grandson, I think great grandson. And
Gottfried, yeah,
I
Gottfried.
explained what it is that I was looking for, and the two of them looked at each other and, and together said, "Songs of a reading of Ashes" by Herzog Wierzbowski. When I read that poetry, it spoke to me absolutely vividly, and I soaked myself in that poetry, and then started to write the songs. That's how it came about. I mean, I think that the first performance was a very powerful. We did actually two performances, 2 nights running. The first performances were very powerful, and certainly spurred me to write more. But the more I soaked myself in my own Judaism, the more I wanted that to be expressed in one way or another in the music that I was writing.
Hmm. Um,
The,
so shall
the
we?
Songs of Ashes, by the way, have had many performances, including 3 performances in Israel on the radio. And the recording we're going to hear this song from, it comes from that recording. It's called "The Silence of the Earth." And much later, Anna and I went to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which is in the suburb of Berlin. And we walked in this massive space, and we were the only people there. And there was this great sense of silence, which I think this song expresses. But then also, there was a much darker side when we went into where the medical experiments had taken place. That's also, I think, to some extent expressed in this song, although the song was written much earlier than that.
So let's listen to the Silence of the Earth from Songs of Ashes. If I can get this to play.
Sung by Miriam Meltzer and Ora Rotem Nelkin on the piano.
Lovely voice. grapes are not afraid to grow. The roads do not run off into the fields. The roadside stones do not whine. The smooth air does not crumble. The wind breathes no and the autumn not a word, nor a leaf, nor a sound were devoured by the roots of the
That seems to be have got cut off. I'm not sure why right at the end, but the, wonderful. One of the 15 songs there from Songs of Ashes. Um, Julian, yeah, it's a sort of response to the poetry, which is sort of really telling that you somehow you brought your personal sort of emotion into the poet's world and sort of reinterpreted it in the music and come up with something really powerful. And it's you mentioned polytonality. I mean, that there's we can talk about sort of technical issues. There's obviously a tradition of songwriting going into that, um, but it's really how it's the sort of the visceral effect I think of these poems which really strikes me, and I think it must have struck so many people because it's been performed often on Yom HaShoah or on Holocaust Day, various memorial events, not only because of the text, but because it is such a powerful piece. I just actually have to remember one. I think the last time I heard it with you, and you mentioned, of course, the powerful impact of Nietzsche Spyro in producing this, as it were, uh, creation. It was, I think, it was at the Polish embassy, and poor Robin, who passed away, and we remember with very great fondness Robin Spyro.
indeed.
Uh, and he was sort of taken ill in the middle of the concert, and it was a
Yeah,
very dramatic, and I just have that memory. And but he was, fortunately, he was actually okay afterwards. But
yeah,
that was a
yeah.
one, that was a very strong performance. Um, I mean, in writing Holocaust music, I mean, is it right? It's performed on those occasions. How about if you performed it in a sort of, a leader recital at the Wigmore Hall with a bit of Mozart and a bit of sort of Debussy do you think it fits that? Could it fit that sort of occasion, or do we have to
Not,
reserve these things only for, you know, the sacred moment of the memorialization? How does that work? Do you think?
it certainly in my mind doesn't go with a bit of Britain and a bit of Mozart.
Okay.
It has been performed with an introduction to the concert by my elegy for violin and piano, and that
Mm.
does suit it very, very well. Um, uh,
So it
the
needs a context.
power,
It needs a context.
the power of the work is so great that I think it should stand basically alone.
Right. How about a bit of sort of Schoenberg's Survivor from Warsaw in the second half or something?
It's,
I'm just
I don't.
sorry, I'm being frivolous. I'm not trying to be frivolous. I'm
I
just
think
trying to
not.
think of a sort of, way of.
Look,
No, it
uh,
has a special power. Yeah.
this has to finish a concert, whatever.
Yeah.
Um, okay. No. I think I think it is something for Holocaust Memorial Day or some other event that concentrates on the show.
Right. So,
Yes.
um, le- this is one aspect of, as it were, you're coming to grips with Jewish identity and sort of aspects of Jewish history, and then you set off on a completely different path, and you set Hebrew texts in your
Yes.
song cycles, which is a new departure. And you've got, I mean, three big song cycles. You've got the songs from Samuel HaNagid, the medieval poet. You've got songs from Shir HaShirim, the Song of Solomon, the famous Song of Songs. And you have a piece called Jewish Songs, which is basically a collection of traditional melodies of Jewish songs. Could be liturgical, could be some folk, but actually in your own inimitable style, in your own arrangement, a little bit like Benjamin Britten, who does English folk song arrangements. Now, in
Right.
all those things, you had to set Hebrew text. So I just wanted to ask you before we listen to a couple of the examples which we're going to do, how did you manage that sort of leap into the new language, into Hebrew setting? And what were the challenges for you? Um, and did you have any sort of models to grapple, that you could sort of use for that?
Well, I didn't do it for a long time. I didn't set any Hebrew text for a very long time. Um, uh, Not until I felt that I really understood the scansion of the text, and that came partly through being continually at synagogue services. It came partly through study. It came partly through sessions I had with our lovely Hassan Stephen Kotzen, who helped me enormously.
This is at the
Uh,
New London
yeah,
synagogue.
yeah. And I would and still do listen to people reading the text until I really kind of feel the scansion of the text, and then the music starts to come. But it took a long time to get there. To that point.
So, so we're not we're going to listen to a little bit of two different types of texts. So one is the Shir HaShirim, which is obviously biblical, and
Yes.
the other one is Samuel HaNagid. I mean, perhaps you wanted to say, we're going to hear them in that order, but maybe you want to say something about Samuel HaNagid before, you know, even though we're going to hear Shir HaShirim first. Just why, how did also
Well,
the medieval
Small
Hebrew is
Hanagid
different, isn't it?
Small Hanagid lived from 993 to 1056. He was born in Cordoba and was a renowned Talmudist and statesman, and led the armies of Cordoba in victorious campaigns. He was a patron of many other poets, but he was well known for his own poetry, and a lot of which was written in the battlefield. I found these poems in the Hebrew book of Jewish poetry, and what attracted me to them was that most of them were simply four simple lines long. But within those simple lines, the power that was expressed in these poems was just enormous. I mean, it was this whole thing of the most difficult thing to create in art is straightforwardness and simplicity, and at the same time find power. That's what attracted me to the boat. There's actually 8 songs in the cycle. A lot of them are very short. In relation to Shir HaShirim, I think my music should be useful. And I'd contemplated setting Shir HaShirim for some years, but didn't know how to do it. The idea of setting the whole book was daunting, to say the least. Until my great friend Gerald Rothman had a birthday, and I suddenly saw that I could choose a number of verses, a short number of verses from Shir HaShirim that, to my mind, related to his relationship with his wife, Rabbi Elena, and that's what I did. I chose texts to represent what I felt was their relationship. We play
So
it.
So let's listen
This is
to,
this is this is the third of the four songs,
yeah,
and it's a joyous song,
exactly. So
sung
we'll
by
start
Jason
with that.
Green and Joseph Ramadan.
Hinach ya farayati, hinach ya faina ich yonim, mi ba'ad letzamateich, sorech keter ha'izim shegalesho, me ha'gil'ad. Shinayich keter ha'ketzuvot, she'alu min ha'arza, she'kulam matimot ve'shakula ein bahem. כחוט השני שפתותייך וממראית נווה כפלח הרימון הכתך מבעד לצמתך כמגדל דוד צווארך בנוי לתלפיות אלף המגן תלוי עליו כל שלטי הגיבורים שני שדייך כשני עופרים תאומך זבייה הרואים בשושנים עד שיפוח היום ונסו הצללים מלך לי אל ההמון ואל גבעת הלבונה כולך יפה רעייתי כולך יפה רעייתי mein Bach, mein Bach.
Julian, let's go straight on and we'll hear the two songs from the Hanagid cycle.
Yes.
And I just preempt it by saying that you mentioned some of them are short. The second one is under a minute. So just to tell everybody that these are it's hold on to your seats as it were. Here we go.
הלעודני
Oh,
שוכן ואוהג כמו ערב ותחת יריעה כל ימותיי מדורי
sorry, I started with the wrong one. I'm terribly sorry. I'm going to go back. We're going to start with the correct one, which is the first one. Oh, no, I've got technical hitch.
תבין כלון שמחת לב בין שתביא חיות לך נמצאת תבכה ויתמוח אלי עולם אתה ויחייב כך אני שוכן באוהל מוערב ותחת ירייה כל ימותיי מדורי כמו שכחוני הערבה והזמן חצרי בעירי ידידי חצרי ידידי חצרי
Well, that's the two songs from Hanagid. I wanted to actually ask you. You mentioned polytonality, and I was wondering whether you can say something about your use of perhaps modality. Is there something going on particularly in the Shir HaShirim? I know that there are traditional modes, as it were, for singing Shir HaShirim, but I'm not saying that you're using those. But there seems to be a sort of that plangent sort of quality to it. I'm just wondering whether you get that from some conscious use of modes.
Yes, a lot of my music is in some sense modal, using quite different modes. And I think that that's a development from listening to Chazan in the synagogue and listening to and taking part in the synagogue music. I think I get that. I always was very aware of the modes, but I think my music has become more modal as time has gone on, and I think that Jewish music has been an influence in that regard. But I certainly do use modes quite consciously, not any particular one, but changing modes from time to time.
Thank you. So I also sort of hear them in some of your instrumental works, like the piece we're going to hear now, which is actually a piano piece. It's say something a little bit about why you wrote it, or it's something to do with it's a psalm. It's reflections on a psalm. So
right, this is another present for my my cousin's grandson. He was about to be confirmed in the Jewish church, in the German church. His mother's German, and from what I've said before, you'll know that the rest of my family are not Jewish. I'm quite happy to write a piece for a church service of that kind because it was based on a Jewish text. I asked him to choose a psalm that meant something to him. And it spoke to me too. I've written a whole number of pieces that are purely instrumental pieces with religious texts as titles. There's plenty of precedent for this, going from Bach's choral preludes for organ, right through to Messiaen, who headed many of his pieces with religious texts, in his case, Catholic ones. So this is my interpretation of the psalm at the moment I wrote the piece, and of course everybody who hears it will have a different experience of it. As you say, what the psalm says is represented on the screen.
So we're going to not hear the whole piece, but I just explained that it's a sort of in what we call ternary form, which is a sort of ABA form, sandwich form we call it, and in the filling of the sandwich, it's the joy element, as it were, and I suspect the idea of, well, this is a bit simplistic, but the sort of calmer outer sections perhaps have something to do with the notion of supplicant. But let's pick it up at the beginning of the middle section, and then we'll come into the sort of varied repeat of the opening to finish off. Beautiful. And the pianist there was
Mitra Alice Tam,
Mitra. Thank you very
a
much.
Malaysian pianist.
So, Julian, I don't know actually what we're doing with time. What I'm just explaining that we still have a few examples to listen to, and then I'm hoping to throw it open to sort of a more general discussion for everyone to be able to make some comments and ask some questions. Before we do so, we have got a couple of more examples of music, but this is actually relating to the synagogue and to what synagogue music is or what it could be. And I just wanted to start this off with a little bit of a discussion. I mean, we're on, in this forum, we've had all sorts of discussions of synagogue music, Hazanut and Sephardi music, and the sort of analysis aspects, the practical performer. You're a composer who's attempted to write for this, I mean, have written for the synagogue, but you have sort of quite strong views. In an interview a while ago, you told me what I've put on the screen here. First of all, that you've not been able to write as much synagogue music as you wanted to. That was the first thing, and the second thing you said was that in the church there's a thing, an item called the anthem, and that is a particular a sort of concept of worship, let's say, which is about listening. Now, whether you think you said that you don't think there's such a thing in the sort of in Jewish in the synagogue service as where you actually sort of participate by listening. And, I mean,
I
that has
think
all sorts of connotations. But anyway, if you want to expand on that, do you still agree with what you said then, or you've written quite a lot of music since then?
Yes, no, I do. I've written relatively little music for the synagogue, and I mean this as no criticism of my synagogue. I love my synagogue, but new music is not something that is readily accepted in the synagogue. They want to be led in music that they know. And I've had little opportunity. What opportunity I have had came when we had a choir, and it was around the High Holy Days. Um, uh, there isn't exactly an equivalent to the anthem. The anthem in the cathedral service is where the congregation sit down and the choir sing a setting of a biblical text or religious text, and hopefully that moves the people. In my synagogue, that would be very, very much reacted to by, I don't come to synagogue to go to a concert. There is the Chazan's job is primarily to lead the congregation in prayer. There are moments in the Chazanut where the Chazan does a lot, something that's much more elaborate and complicated, but usually there's only one piece like that in a service. The main job of the Chazan is to lead the prayer of the congregation, not to have the congregation listen to the Chazan, as it were. So I think that what I've been able to do for the synagogue itself has been limited, but that's no criticism of my synagogue. As I say, I love my synagogue, and I found ways of expressing my Judaism in other ways.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we'll keep that one for the debate. Because
Yeah,
you said many things there which are going to spark things off. I'm not going to say, but I think it's a very interesting concept, because we have this central prayer which uses the concept of, hear, O Israel, listen, Shema, and the listening aspect, but yet we're sort of often, as you say, there's a sort of a negative connotation with it. There's some sort of passivity um, associated with listening, but of course there's such a thing as active listening. It's not a
yes,
passive. It isn't a passive process
that would
at
be my
all. It's too
argument.
simplistic. Yes, and so I mean, there's much to be said about that. So, but let's on the basis of what you just said, I'd like to actually hear one of your um, sung pieces that you've written for the service, and this one is actually for the slichot, as you mentioned. But the interesting thing about this, and I have to say, I find it very interesting that you actually wrote it as a set of three pieces, which we're going to be doing on the slichot. That's the service which is sort
Right.
of it's done on you before Yom Kippur. It's
It's the
obviously
beginning of
doesn't
the High Holy Days.
it doesn't conflict with, let's say, the rules of Shabbat, in the same sense of actually, let's say, writing for a Sabbath
That's right.
service. So you've actually included an instrumental piece in this, a piano piece, as well as some choral pieces. So that's really interesting that you've actually
Yes.
gone a bit further and sort of abstracted away from the text and done a meditation as the central thing. So we're going to hear first of all this. Choral
Come along.
setting, and then a little bit of the abstracted meditation on some of the tunes of the service. So let me find the recording wherever that is gone, disappeared somewhere. Uh, it's
It's at the top, isn't it?
Here it is somewhere. Here we go. Sorry, I've just stopped it. And now is another piece from the same service, Slichot. And what Julian has done here is he's taken the familiar tune for the Shema Kolenu, sung on Yom Kippur. Shema Kolenu. It's a very familiar melody, and he's written a set of four variations on the theme. And what we're going to do now is not listen to the whole piece because it is actually quite long. We're just going to cut into the third variation, which is actually where he departs radically from the theme into a completely different mood, not the sort of this calm slichot type of mood of sort of introspection, and then comes back miraculously into the theme, but now melodically decorated, and ends with this beautiful final cadence, which is familiar from the sort of choral version. And this is performed on the piano. This is played on the piano, and the question arises, again, context. I'm very interested in this. When obviously it can be played, it will be for some people, it would be quite unusual to have a piano piece played as part of a service in a synagogue. Others will be more familiar with that. Um, what happens if you play it in a concert in a concert hall? Here's the third variation and to the end of Shema Kolenu variation meditations. He's trying to get. Uh,
Hi,
right.
Judy. Yeah, how are you?
Well, on the other side of the coin, we have the flip side of the coin, which are sacred prayers, as it were, for that you've written for the concert hall. I'm
Yeah.
not. I'm wondering whether we're going to hear just two short extracts. One is a Kaddish, which obviously is a part of the service, but set for the concert hall, and the other one is a um. Actually, there's one which is ambiguous, which is the priestly blessing. I'm just wondering whether that's, it might be used in either setting. But I'm just wondering sort of what your views are on that. You're setting Kaddish for the concert hall. I mean, there's obviously precedents. We've got Malcolm Singer, in fact, who was here giving a talk on COZ a while ago, wrote a wonderful Kaddish for the BBC Singers, which was done in St John Smith Square as a concert piece. And I had
Also,
an interesting, yeah,
Ravel
and
wrote a very
Ravel
great.
wrote, yes, and we
Mm.
have the Kaddish, in the symphony by Bernstein and all sorts of things. So, but I
Well,
think
it's
I'm just wondering whether yours is slightly different. Yours is slightly different because you've got two cousins actually. That's one of the interesting things.
well,
So,
what I was trying to do is what the Kaddish prayer is, which is a prayer of praise to God and magnification of God's name. It was originally written for one singer, but when it came to the CD Echoes of the Soul, I decided to redo it for two singers. A lot of decisions that are made in composition, in creation, are not altogether conscious. And I don't really know why I did that, but I assume that I thought that two singers would enhance the strength of the expression of the piece in a way that one singer didn't quite do.
I think it certainly brings out something in the text which is we don't usually hear, which is a sort of the dialogue element, which is
The
not
dialogue
usually
element,
there.
dialogue between the two singers, yes.
Yeah. So I'm afraid we're going to not hear the whole thing, but I'm just going to cut into the sort of final section, which is the Oseh Shalom, may there be peace. And what you hear at the end is this. It's sort of a refrain that Julian's built into it on the amens. Whenever they come earlier on, he has this wonderful type of contrapuntal development of the amen figure, and we'll hear it sort of once at the end. But if you hear the whole thing, you've heard it before. So here is the Oster Shalom from the Kaddish.
Amen. O se shalom bimchoma. O ya se shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael.
Well, and now yet another, as it were, guise of Jewish music, which is the priestly blessing, but in English. So,
It was a commission. That's why it's in English, because the choir Chiswick Baroque required it to be in English. It was written for the concert hall, but it and of course with all my choral pieces, it really reflects that experience of my childhood with choral music.
but do you think now, Julian? I'm just going to put it to you. If you put a few Hebrew words there instead, do you think we might sing this in the synagogue? Okay, I'm leaving that as a question. Let's listen to it.
Yes, that's possible. I just haven't got round to redoing it in Hebrew.
So we're going to pick it up just for the blessings, not the whole thing. Um, and I mean, we've just got a little bit more to listen to, and then we'll open it up. Sorry.
Bless you and protect you. The Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. The Lord bestow his favor upon you and grant you peace. And grant you peace. The Lord bless you and protect you. The Lord deal kindly and graciously with you. The Lord bestow his favor upon you and grant you peace. Thus they shall link my name with the people of Israel, the people of Israel, and I will bless them. Will bless them. And I will bless them.
Well, we have quite a lot of examples, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to, I think in the interest of time, Julian, I think we're going to just talk about the one big example, which is your cantata for Pesach, and then we'll come back to the instrumentals just to sort of close with, if that's okay with you. Um, we've been looking at lots of song texts and Hebrew and Holocaust poetry, and one interest which seems to have fired you for many years is this sort of dramatic, I mean, going back to your theatre experience, dramatic scale of certain pieces, large scale works. So the first piece you wrote was The Death of Moses. That was a sort of cantata back in 2003.
Yes.
Um, and it was a nine section piece in which the narrator was Moses, questioning his fate. It's a famous text, and and um, it's sort of interspersed with choruses of different natures, and it was, I think, it was performed by Aelith Choral Society, and it was a very, very powerful piece, and and philosophical too. Exploring sort of really deep ideas, and a number of composers, including Joseph Tal and Alexander Goer, have dealt with that text of the death of Moses. Then you followed it with I think it was the Oratorio on Ruth, which was a
Yes.
Shavuot oratorio, and then Shirat Hayam, which is a famous part of the Torah, the poem, the Song of the Sea after the crossing of the Red Sea, and you set this in a sort of dramatic way, but fantastically imaginative. You made it into a sort of cello concerto. So it wasn't only a choral piece, but the cello was a sort of protagonist, I suppose, and you had wonderful Gemma Rosefield playing it in the premiere.
Absolutely.
And in fact, before we talk about the next piece, which is this Pesach cantata, which was done in 2016, I just wondered if you could say something about Gemma and yourself. You've written a number of pieces for her, and how did she? What was it? Was it just that she happened to be there to perform it, or did you have some sort of? Did
No,
you have her in mind when you wrote it?
I've known Gemma for a long time, and she had already recorded my cello sonata on my sonata CD. I had this idea of interspersing the actual setting of the Shirat Hayam text with cello solos that were headed by psalm verses that I thought related to Shirat Hayam in one way or another. So there are 8 sections to the piece, and each section was headed by a solo cello piece with headed itself by a psalm quote, which related, in my mind at any rate, to Shirat Hayam.
I'm just wondering about the. Sorry.
It also included the Song of Miriam.
Right, and I just wondered. I mean, the idea of the cello. If you can elaborate. I mean, do you get the resonances of sort of Bloch, Shlomo, the cello? It has a particular.
Absolutely.
Does it have some biblical connotation?
Doesn't have a biblical connotation, but it is the instrument I don't play that I would love to be able to play. It means a great deal to me, the cello, and I think I write pretty well for it.
Well, I know you wrote a wonderful piece actually for our son's bar mitzvah, which based on a biblical
Like the song,
verse.
yes,
Write a song yourself, and that's. But I mean, you've written a cello sonata and cello suite, and so there's a lot of repertoire there. So now we come to um, the
basic.
the 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 Pesach piece, yeah. Um, so this is Julian reclining, as in the Seder. And I'll just explain that this piece is a wonderful piece. It's actually it's a sort of a reenactment in a way, musical theatre of an actual Seder, and the characters are some of the grandfather, obviously, who's conducting the Seder, and the grandchild. And Julian will probably say what happens with that in a second. But the other characters are sort of Moses, Miriam, Aaron, Rabban Gamliel, and all our familiar faces. They're all sitting round the Seder and participating in this piece. And there's something that you said about the why you wrote this piece, having written all the other ones, that there was something about the redemptive quality of all those in the Shirat Hayam, and this was sort of a natural thing
Natural
to
progression.
progression. So I just wondered if you can say, I see that we have Rabbi Roderick Young with us here. I just wondered if you could say something about how, the genesis of the piece, how how the ideas came to you, and how you got to know your librettist, and what sort of things that you thought about, perhaps even before you got to the final version. What was in the air there. I mean,
Well,
what came out is a wonderful piece.
Rabbi Rodri Young was somebody who I knew very well. He's a great friend of mine. and I asked him to write the libretto for this piece. He did a wonderful libretto. Going back to my childhood, oratorio was a big thing in my childhood. I loved the great oratorios, even though some of them, the text of which I didn't agree with. So, for example, I loved Elgar's Dream of Gerontius. I loved Haydn's The Creation. I loved the B minor Mass. I loved the Verdi Requiem. And so the idea of expressing religious ideas in this storytelling form was something that I also brought from my childhood. The Death of Moses and Ruth and Shirat Hayam were all pieces that I wrote because they seemed to me to be, in one way or another, the most important. And the Pesach cantata really followed on from that. I mean, it's the Shirat Hayam is one of the most important moments in Jewish history. The Pesach Pesach itself is one of the most important celebrations, reflections in the Jewish year. So it was a natural thing to want to set Pesach cantata, having done those other three. And I approached Roddy Young and asked him if he would write a libretto, which he did very, very skillfully.
What I found really interesting about the piece is, I mean, you could have just said, okay, I'm going to set the story. You know, that would have been one approach. You could have tried to sort of set the Haggadah or something, but you did more than that. I mean, you actually created a scene where you have the grandfather leading the service, but then you have this amazing switch at the end, which is that having brought to life, in a way, some of the characters that are just there on the page for us, like Rabban Gamliel, who sort of sings. You have, I mean, is it a spoiler if I say that the role of the grandchild at the end, that the grandchild suddenly becomes the grandfather and sort of is running the Seder. And there's this beautiful switch, and you sort of arrive at, there's a sort of rounded, the generations at the end of the piece have it's a sort of it's like sort of the late Beethoven quartets. You know, you can keep going on and on and on. It goes.
That's a brilliant aspect of the libretto. Of course, Pesach is about children. It's about telling the story to children. But then the children become adults and they have their own children, and that switch was very well created within the libretto, and I thought it was a wonderful idea.
So we're going to listen, Julian, to this dramatic climax in the middle of the piece, which is the 10 plagues. And do you want to say something about how you set that while I just get it on the screen here?
Yes, absolutely. This is the 10 plagues, which become more and more intense as they go along, to the point where the grandfather at the end is completely stressed out. The role of the chorus is just to state the plagues, each plague as they go along. I think it's quite dramatic.
Well, what can you say to that? Unfortunately, I stopped at a rather dramatic moment. We have a few extra, like about 4 minutes worth of music that we wanted to finish with. On a slightly jollier note, I have to say. But before that, it would be really nice if people wanted to ask some questions, maybe take up some of the polemical things that Julian's said about synagogue music earlier, or maybe or any aspect want to ask Julian something. I don't know if whether somebody's checking the chat box. We maybe open it up to the floor and then come back in at the end. We'll sort of round it off if that's okay. I don't know whether um,
Uh,
somebody's
there've been
somebody's.
a few very nice comments in the chat, not necessarily questions, but if somebody'd like to raise their virtual or physical hand, we can try and see who's. Uh, maybe Roderick would like to say a word or two about the libretto.
Well, I'll just say that it was such an enormous privilege when Julian asked me to do this and was utterly terrifying. I'd never done anything like it. And I said to him, which comes first, music or words? And he was so wonderful. He just said, don't panic, just write me something and I will work with it. And it was such an incredible collaboration. And it was really one of the highlights of my life, I have to say.
Oh, that's wonderful. Rachel.
Lower my hand here now that thank you. This was wonderful. I before I ask my question, I have to say I really love the fact that the plague sequence is so grim and the music is kind of jolly and dancey. That was wonderful. There's something about that I really loved. The question that I had though was about I Never Saw Another Butterfly, and it was something that struck me while I was listening to this, that you had set the piece for children's voices, like prepubescent children's voices. But Pavel Friedman, the poet, was 21 when he wrote this poem, which is, it's very, very young. It's university age, but it's still, post-pubescent. And I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit, because I've heard a number of composers who've set that poem, and it's set for children's voices, but Pavel Friedman wasn't really a child when he wrote it. So I was just sort of wondering if you could speak a little bit about your choice to use the voices of very small children for this kind of text.
Yes. Well, he was an exception in that regard, in terms of children who wrote the other poems. And I was thinking about the whole situation of children being in Theresienstadt, and I feel it has been performed by adult singers, but it's been performed twice by individual children and twice by the children's choir and recorded children's choir. And I think that there's a very particular poignancy in that when the children are actually performing it. That's really. Really, you're right about Pavel, but he's an exception in terms of those poems. I wanted to write that nevertheless because I think it's a very powerful and very poignant poem.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that Ella has asked whether some of your cello works are suitable for amateur players, or they're very...
Sure. The sonata isn't, I don't think, but the Write This Song for Yourself is, and some of the cello pieces from Shirat Hayam are okay for good amateur cellists.
I can put you in touch with Julian and he'll do that.
Do so.
Okay, Robert?
Thank you. Yes, Julian and Malcolm, thank you so much. I've known so much about your music, Julian, but this has been a wonderful session and putting it all together. And I think obviously you've written a huge amount of music, but you have created your own style and made your own mark. I know from my working with you that some of your songs are quite challenging to perform, but very memorable. I still have them going through my head after I don't know how many years, since I
Yes,
think the songs of the
you did
Samuel,
songs of Hanagid at one point.
I think we did the first performance together of that,
We did.
and it was really memorable. And thank you so much for all you have done and continue to do for Jewish music.
Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate that enormously.
Alex.
Hi. Thank you so much, Julian. I mean, I am, my breath's been taken away by this pleasure that you have given me in your diversity in the music. But one thing that I cannot understand, and it comes up over and over again, that you cannot be uplifted through just listening from passive music in the synagogue. In inverted commas, it's called a concert, but it isn't. And your type of music, the shul service or the synagogue service would benefit from it, as would other choral pieces like that. You can go to a concert and come out elated. You can go to the cinema and come out elated by seeing a good film. You can go to a documentary and come out elated. Why can't you sit in a synagogue with the right settings and the music and come out just in a completely different world? And your music sets this tone in the synagogue, especially your slichas, and I would love to see it performed as a piece in a synagogue completely. Whatever the synagogue is, it doesn't matter whether it's Orthodox or Conservative, egalitarian. The words and the music are so emotive and sets the scene. So your heartstrings, it touches wherever it should touch, and that's the beauty of it. So can you please tell your people in your synagogue and those that make the decisions, let's try it and see what the public want, as opposed to just because 2 or 3 people say no, it doesn't mean no.
Yes, I really don't want to be critical of my synagogue. I love my synagogue, and we don't have a choir. That's one thing. We did, and what I wrote, some of the things I wrote for the liturgy were when we did have a choir. The nusach is really critical to our synagogue, as it should be. I agree with you. I think that what people don't realize, of course, is that all the music that they hear, most of the music they hear, was at one time composed, most of it in the late 19th century. But then Lewandowski had a choir, an organ. He had all the accoutrements to write the kind of music that he did. And I'm all for that. But I simply don't have that in my synagogue. So I decide to do it a different way. But I agree, it would be wonderful if one could write new music for the synagogue.
The emotions would be tremendous.
I'm in difficulty here because I feel as though I'm criticizing my synagogue, and I absolutely don't want to do that. All the people.
Can I come in just a? Can I just step in a little bit, because I think it's a very big topic actually. New music for the synagogue, and we've heard about from Samuel Adler, who's written for the in America for synagogue music in a modernist style, and there's sort of people that have taken that sort of path. And I mean, you say nusach is important, but also progressive styles, beyond the 19th century, are can somehow refer to, there's a challenge there, but I mean, there's plenty that a composer could do. But as you say, there's a problem about people wanting to hang on to tradition, and so it's a big topic.
Malcolm, Leonard Bernstein's first musical writings were for the synagogue, and that started
Yeah.
on his work, and that's 20th century. That's not 19th
Yes.
century.
No, I think
And
what
it's accepted the same as you have in the Central Synagogue in New York and Park East and David Lefkowitz. Works are commissioned specifically for synagogue, and they enhance the services. It's because you don't know about it doesn't mean it's wrong.
No,
because
yeah,
little is known, that's why it's not used or utilized. If more is known, it's the same as anything becoming popular. You play it over, and people enjoy it and tell other people. So, Julian, the ball's in your court, young man.
If there are people from my synagogue listening to this, I invite them to commission me.
Quite right.
In fact, it's not Julian who doesn't want his music performed in the synagogue. It's rather the other way around. Or maybe synagogues don't know. And as Malcolm says, this is a huge issue of, each synagogue has its own tradition, its own loves, its own hates, and its own permissions. And I don't think we'll ever quite get to the bottom of it. But if we have wonderful music and it's offered, it's there for the taking. So,
education.
I don't want to criticize my synagogue, though.
No, you're not. You're not. Let me do that, Julian. But it's not your synagogue I'm criticizing. It's other places. It's not just you or your synagogue. It's because people don't understand what they're missing until you taste something. You don't know what you're missing. So people say you don't know until you've had that taste. So let's give them a taste so that they will enjoy it. And that's all I'm asking for. Some of the synagogues to open their minds, open their hearts, and let them have a little taste and then make an appetizer. So if they like the appetizer, they can go on to the main course. But at least try the appetizer.
To be fair, there have been some appetizers from me in the synagogue service, mostly around the High Holy Days.
I think it's wonderful that you've done all these wonderful settings, and also that they've commissioned them and performed them. And it would be lovely to. It's a step in the right direction, as Alex has said. It's like we need more, and it's fantastic. So I'd just like to. I don't know if there are any pressing questions, but we wanted to finish off with something a little bit sort of upbeat, if that's okay. So I'll just get back to the screen, and so somebody's actually joining in the conversation here. Is it? Yes. Can we read that comment out? David Lawrence, it is not a question of commission music, it's that a concert piece is for passive listening, and the shul, it's the community taking part. So that really plays into this whole debate which we were trying to raise. The idea is that there's active listening and passive. Listening isn't only passive, and that's maybe an issue to address, but it's something to debate. But anyway, not for now. But it sort of brings it up. Just
Let's end with the violin sonata.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So there were three pieces which actually were instrumental pieces, which sort of have a strong bearing on Julian's creative sort of outlook. And one, he mentioned it earlier, actually, the elegy, because it's actually, that's one of the pieces that could be performed in a concert with the Songs of Ashes, because it's concerned with this issue of sort of universal suffering, but it came from a very personal place in Julian's life, as it were, and outlook. I don't know if you want to say something about that, but what we're going to do is, I think, end with the violin sonata, which is, elegy is for violin, of course, violin and piano, and the violin sonata is a 3-movement piece. It's a wonderful concert piece, but it ends with a movement which one could say is a sort of a rondo based on a theme which has something to do with klezmer music. I'm not sure exactly whether it is intended directly that, but it certainly evokes that. And whether you play it in the synagogue or in the Wigmore Hall, it has that wonderful spirit. There's another wonderful piece, the Clarinet Sonata, which has a very jazzy feel. But I think, Julian, shall we just choose the Violin Sonata
Yes.
to finish with? So,
Yes. Let me just say a word about it.
sure, thank you.
Because it's an interesting thing that it took me a very long time to write this piece. I did it over 3 or 4 years, and I revised it and revised it and revised it and couldn't get it right. And I think the reason for that was that I started off writing it for the wrong reason. I had a friend who is a very good violinist, professional violinist, and fell on hard times. And I decided I'd write the sonata in order to get him back to play again. And I think that was the wrong reason for doing it. It wasn't until I was able to internalize the piece for myself that suddenly I was able to make it work. That's just an interesting thing. A number of people have commented on the influence of klezmer in this piece. I'm not aware of that, but of course one's influences come out unconsciously in all sorts of ways. And I accept that influence is there in this piece. So let's end with it.
So we're going to pick up in one of the interludes that leads to the rondo theme, and that at the end of the sonata.
Okay.
Bravo.
Thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
What a lovely way to end something so fantastic. So, Malcolm, thank you so much for bringing Julian and giving us this opportunity to listen not only to his words, but to hear his music. And to have an opportunity to spend a couple of hours in your company and to explore your music has been truly wonderful. And I want to thank you on behalf of everybody, Mark and Laurie in Los Angeles, Martha, who's in Dresden, and Alex and everybody. It's just been extraordinary to be able to be here with you and a lot of your friends and admirers. So thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure to do it.
Thank you, Julian, and thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you to everybody. We hope to see you again next week. Malcolm will be on next week as well, talking to Asaf Sheleg from Israel, who has written a book about Israeli art music. And as I said before, you know, Israeli art music is one of Malcolm's particular interests amongst his many, many particular interests. And so we look forward to hearing. Do you want to say anything about that, Malcolm?
Well, just very briefly, just Asaf Sheleg is one of the sort of most interesting young musicologists, not just Israeli musicologists, and he's just written his second book on Israeli music, which has a very interesting title, which we'll be discussing next time. There is going to be a sort of a playlist put up for some of the examples that we'll be discussing, so to look out for that. If you'd like to come, be delighted to welcome you next week.
Yeah, it's on the same link as this one and the same time, and we very much look forward to seeing you. So once more, a huge thank you, Julian. Thanks so
Thank
much for
you.
bringing
Pleasure.
us into your
Pleasure.
music. For me too, you know, we've tried so hard for me to get to grips with your music, and here we are. We've been able to do this in such a lovely way. So
Great.
Well, I hope everyone will get Julian's CD, Echoes of the Soul, and listen to his music, which is and look at his website, and
absolutely, I've put
definitely.
the link into the chat, so people have been able to see it. But I can email you the link if you want it. We sent it out to people on the list yesterday. If you'd like to join the Jewish music list at Humanities Commons, please do that, and then you'll stay connected and you'll be able to see everything that is going on, both in the conversations on Zoom and in any other channels that we are operating on. So thank you to everybody.
Geraldine,
And
do you want to mention tomorrow evening the
yes, I
voice
think,
of the cantor? So could you please do that?
would you like to, Alex?
I'm losing my voice and it's gone a bit hazerig. So
Tomorrow, the European Association has been doing a series of talks called The Voice of the Cantor. And this time it's not to hear about them singing, it's to hear about their opinions and their joys and difficulties of the profession as it is today. And we've had, do we need nusach? Do we need a rabbi? What is the Karlebach problem in synagogues? And tomorrow we are looking at the new Europe. So many communities are now emerging after the Holocaust. There's training for cantors at the Geiger Institute, and we have a number of cantors, one from Vienna, from Budapest, from Prague, talking to us about the joys and the highs and lows of being a cantor in the new emerging Europe. And that should be really interesting. And on the 1st of July, the last session is looking at the future of the female cantor. And we're looking at how the cantorate is spreading beautifully in this way. So these sessions are on a Wednesday at 7. If you look at the European Cantors Association website, you'll see it. And that is cantors.eu, www.cantors.eu. And that's the